The Second Chechen War began with the explosions of residential buildings in Moscow and Volgodonsk, as well as the crossing of Chechen forces into Dagestan. But there's a small detail.
Houses were destroyed and many people were injured. The Russians began night patrols, while television reported that the explosives had been planted by Chechens, but...
The FSB is suspected of being involved in the bombings because in Ryazan, a resident saw 4 people unloading something into a basement from a car with concealed license plates and called the police.
But the investigation showed that the explosives that's the same as those used in the Moscow bombings. The next day, the first suspects were arrested. But it turns out they are also FSB employees.
Путин говорит, что меня научили любить Родину в КГБ. То есть, когда Путин писал доносы на своих сокурсников, его учили любить Родину.
A book was even written about this by former FSB agent Alexander Litvinenko, who was killed.
Litvinenko was killed in 2006 in London, poisoned with polonium. According to the investigation, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun carried out the murder on orders from Moscow.
Какие здесь могут быть комментарии? Те люди, которые сделали это, не Господь Бог, а господин Литвиненко, к сожалению, не Лазарь.
In the Eastern Orthodox Church, Lazarus is venerated as righteous Lazarus, the 4 days dead.
Putin, then the head of the FSB, replaces Stepashin as a prime minister. He unified the people and began establishing Russian order.
And so began the so-called special operation in Dagestan, which then spread into Chechnya. Entire cities were destroyed. On October 22nd, 1999, federal forces banned civilians fleeing from shelling and bombing from crossing the Chechen border. 4 days later, on October 26, 1999, Russian state media announced that from October 29th, a humanitarian corridor would open for those leaving Chechnya. Russian military forces have begun preparations to open 4 corridors on October 29th for displaced persons to exit the so-called sanitary zone. The roads will be controlled by Russian military forces. Currently, all movement of people and vehicles from Chechnya and in the opposite direction has been halted.
One could more accurately call this not a corridor, but rather a window with no safe path leading to it.
The humanitarian corridor passed through the Kavkaz 1 checkpoint. This post was located on the Rostov-Baku highway at the administrative border between Chechnya and Ingushetia. Thousands of people tried to take advantage of this opportunity. And on October 29th, hundreds of cars gathered along the highway near the Ingushetia border. But that day, the entry into Ingushetia was not permitted. Exit from Chechnya resumed only on November 2nd, 1999. Hundreds of cars with refugees began to turn back toward Grozny along the Rostov-Baku road. However, near the village of Shumiyurt, the convoy was suddenly attacked from the air, resulting in dozens of deaths and injuries.
The European Court of Human Rights found Russia guilty of violating the rights to life of the applicants and their relatives.
Grozny was completely destroyed, and in 2003, the UN declared it the most devastated city in the world. And this, the Russian film about Chechnya.
И те, кому бежать было некуда и не на что. Они выходили из подвалов своих полуразрушенных домов и старались восстановить свой прошлый хрупкий мир. Социта на руинах собирала новую библиотеку.
Of course, Putin didn't like this and began thinking about how to make the media provide the right information.
But if Putin were only concerned about terrorist attacks, he would not have allowed the death of 118 people on the Kursk submarine, which was the flagship of the Russian fleet.
On August 12, 2000, during training exercises in the Barents Sea, the submarine Kursk sank. 2 explosions occurred during the launch of torpedoes, one so powerful it was registered by seismologists in Norway. Most of the crew died instantly, but 23 sailors locked themselves in the 9th compartment awaiting rescue. The problem was that
They weren't even trying to rescue them.
During the disaster, the Russian authorities acted slowly. The first rescue attempt began the next day, and over the following days, officials from the Northern Fleet assured that everything was under control. Only later did they admit the seriousness of the situation, but it was too late. All rescue attempts failed. Russia even refused international assistance. Only on August 20th, when Norwegian divers reached the submarine, was it confirmed that all 118 crew members had perished.
This was a huge blow to Putin, as Russians began to realize that he didn't care about them or freedom of speech. This event marked the beginning of censorship in Russia. Look at the program shown on Channel 1.
История с Курском не закончена. Мы только обозначили минимум самых первых вопросов и выводов. Главный вывод в том, что власть не уважает нас всех, поэтому лжет. И главное, власть обращается с нами так, только и исключительно потому, что мы это позволяем. Всем доброго.
After this, in January 2001, Berezovsky sold his shares of Channel 1 to Abramovich, a friend of Putin.
Berezovsky fled to London to avoid criminal prosecution, and Abramovich transferred the shares to VTB Bank and the National Media Group.
Я, когда встал перед выбором, что мне нужно уехать из России, я больше не могу там оставаться, потому что начались преследования, начались уголовные дела против меня и так далее, но мы сейчас...
He begins the takeover the media, when at the same time making such comments.
Свобода средств массовой информации, права собственности, эти основополагающие элементы цивилизованного общества будут надежно защищены государством.
Then there were mass rallies in support of Putin.
За любовь к Путину в наши дни полагается много халяв.
Пейджер мы получили, еще деньги платят.
А чем вам приходится заниматься?
Чем заниматься? Митинги в основном организовываем и все.
А где?
Ну, везде, где скажут, в поддержку Путина.
Скажите, а кто вам говорит организовывать митинги?
Митинги? Ну, сверху идет администрация.
Какой администрации? Вашего движения?
Нет, президента.
But they didn't help him.
In 2002, during the musical Nord-Ost, terrorists took over the theater and held everyone hostage for 3 days. The terrorists were Chechen and demanded that Russian troops leave Chechnya, and they only wanted to negotiate with certain individuals they named. Notable figures like Kobzon, Leonid Roshal, Grigor Yavlinsky, Irina Kakamata, Alla Pugacheva, Boris Nemtsov, and Moscow's mayor Yuri Lushkov.
But the politicians were not allowed to enter because Putin feared that their political influence might grow.
At 5 a.m. on October 26th, the military stormed the building. They turned off the theater lights and pumped in a sleep-inducing gas.
Я не знаю, мы видим, мы чувствуем, мы дышим в тряпки, что-то делают наши. Все, о, Господи.
By 6:30, the operation was over, but that's when the rescue operation only began. Many hostages were poisoned by the gas, and 125 of them died. The rescue efforts were chaotic. People were simply carried outside and left on the road. When they were brought to hospitals, no one was told what type of gas they had inhaled, and many died because of this. However, the special forces killed the terrorists, and one was captured and sent to prison.
Putin called the operation successful, and no one was held accountable. He blamed journalists for portraying him in a negative light. And Putin began to tighten his control and declared that major changes would take place. And here is what happened next.
Elections were conducted only by party lists after changes in the law. This helped Putin's party secure a majority in parliament, pass laws without input from the other three parties, which also relied financially on the Kremlin.
But what does this have to do with terrorism?
Instead of listening to the people, he enacted pro-Russian measures to weaken them. This was when OMON first began brutally dispersing peaceful protests with batons. In 2007 and 2008, Russian OMON police units conducted violent crackdowns on protests that drew international concern. One of the key incidents occurred in March 2007 in St. Petersburg during the March of Dissenters, organized by the opposition coalition Other Russia, which included leaders like Garry Kasparov. Police used force to disperse protesters and detained over 100 people, including organizers. In Moscow, similar tactics were employed, with police blocking public spaces to prevent gatherings and using violence to break up peaceful protests. After the 2008 presidential election, tensions escalated as newly elected President Dmitry Medvedev promised political reforms. Yet opposition activists and journalists continued to face repression. In December 2008, during another protest against economic policies and authoritarianism, OMON detained about 150 people, including leaders of the new opposition group, Solidarity. Journalists and human rights advocates were also among those detained, sparking international condemnation.
And his speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007.
Мы видим все большее пренебрежение основополагающими принципами международного права. Больше того, отдельные нормы, да по сути чуть ли не вся система права одного государства, прежде всего, конечно, Соединенных Штатов, перешагнула свои национальные границы и, по сути, во всех сферах, и в экономике, и в политике, и в гуманитарной сфере навязывается другим государствам. Ну, кому это понравится?
And in 2008, Russia carried out military aggression against Georgia.
Around Georgia's separatist regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, tensions had been building over many years, fueled by constant propaganda that shaped this generation, and in August 2008, the situation escalated into war.